Yeah. So you want to know how we started this discussion on reparations, or just generally our work in
how you got into this discussion on reparations?
we got into this. Well,
Yeah.
in some ways I would say I was always in it. At least since being on being close to an adult and understanding, at least, in some initial stages, in some limited extent, the history of Black people, history more specifically of Jamaicans, and understanding that, our nation was formed to a great extent through a system of enslavement and colonialism, and understanding that, we, in many ways, we were exploited, and even as a young person, not critically educated in the sense of deliberately engaging with these things. It says that if someone exploits you and does not pay you, then there's something, there's an incomplete equation there.
Welcome everyone. Welcome to the 10th Leicester Human Rights Arts and Film Festival. The festival started on the 4th of December and it runs through to the 10th, and it aims to draw attention to human rights issues at home and abroad. The festival also aims to draw attention to Human Rights Day, which is marked every year around the world on December 10. This year, the festival is being organized in association with Forced Migration and the Arts, and is drawing attention to calls for ceasefires around the world, as well as raising awareness around the crime of genocide. With this in mind, we have declared the month of December to be both Ceasefire Month and Genocide Awareness Month. The 4th till the 10th of December, the duration of this festival, we've declared that to be both Ceasefire Week and Genocide Awareness Week. And the 10th of December, which is Human Rights Day, as well as December 25, which is Christmas Day, we've also declared these to be Ceasefire and Genocide Awareness Days. For today's conversation, we are looking at reparations for slavery and the slave trade. And in doing this, we take note that there are growing calls for reparations to be paid for the enslavement of and trade in African people. We will explore the case for reparations, also look at who should pay these reparations, to whom, how, and why. And to help us in this conversation, we've got two absolutely brilliant speakers, and I am grateful for their being able to join us today. We've got Tavis D. Jules, who is Professor of Higher Education at Loyola University Chicago. Jules' focus and expertise lie in comparative and international education, specifically on decoloniality, racial capitalism, race or racism, terrorism, regionalism, and dictatorial transition issues. He is past president of the Caribbean Studies Association and co-editor-in-chief of Comparative Education Review with Florin D. Salajan. He has co-authored and edited more than 70 refereed articles and book chapters, 3 monographs, and 7 edited books. And we've got Nigel Brissett, who is an associate professor of sustainability and social justice at Clark University in the US. Nigel's scholarship examines education policy reform in the Caribbean in the context of larger global education and socio-economic development forces. His work focuses on the Caribbean human resource development and high-skilled emigration, as well as global discourses of sustainable development and critical responses to and from the Caribbean. And it focuses on education policy reform for educational equity in Jamaica. And his work has appeared in multiple leading journals and edited books. So with that as our introduction, maybe we turn to our speakers. Maybe if you could tell me, how did you get here? How did it start for you?
Yeah. So you want to know how we started this discussion on reparations, or just generally our work in
how you got into this discussion on reparations?
Oh, we got into this. Well,
yeah.
well, in some ways, I would say I was always in it. You know, at least since being on, you know, being close to an adult and understanding, at least, you know, in some initial stages, in some limited extent, the history of Black people, you know, history more specifically of Jamaicans, and understanding that, you know, our nation was formed to a great extent through a system of enslavement and colonialism, and understanding that, you know, we, in many ways, we were exploited. And, you know, even as a young person, not critically educated in the sense of, you know, deliberately engaging with these things, you know, sense that if someone exploits you and does not pay you, then there's something, there's an incomplete equation there. So I guess I've always thought about it, but in terms of critical scholarship, it has increased over time as I delved deeper and deeper in, you know, in issues around development, because my area of study is international education and development, and there's an intersection of those two. There's this notion that, you know, well, education is highly implicated in development, because there's this view that there's a natural synergy, or that education naturally leads to development. It's a very complicated claim and very complicated conversation, but education has become an important component of development. And so studying the two, you know, you get to understand, at least I got to understand the deep ways in which much of the development discourse, you know, and we're talking about contemporary, you know, what we refer to as the post-World War II development, how that discourse and practice, how they're constructed, that much of it is, you know, it is really an exercise in trying to create lifestyles resembling those of the West. And you get to learn that the lifestyles of the West and their economies and, you know, structures and so on were really developed on the backs of enslaved people, others as well, but especially enslaved people, because in many ways Africans built the modern global system. You know, if we think about the money that had developed to, you know, fuel capitalism and the Industrial Revolution, that was a large part through the enslavement of people. And so after, you know, understanding that and, you know, engaging with ongoing, you know, discussions around reparations from, you know, Rastafari, you know, Marcus Garvey, and you know, getting closer also to, you know, African schools of thought, African American ideas around reparations, and increasingly this discussion about how do we repair the damage that has been done to African peoples. And this idea that reparations is not new, it's just much more difficult for Black people and formerly enslaved people to be taken seriously, and their claims to be taken seriously. So, I've always been thinking about this in some way, and I've discussed it in rather in less structured ways in my own writing. But more recently, Tavis brought this idea to me and said, let's engage with this more deliberately. And he had his own calling, and he will explain that. But we got together on this article and really hammered out some really long-standing burning issues which we both had. So this paper came out, when it came out, of an idea, deliberate idea Tavis brought up, and we said let's pursue this a bit. And so this is where we are. It's a long circuitous route. I don't even think I've captured a lot of what brought me here, but given the limited time, I've tried to at least scratch some of this the surface of this.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Nigel. So a couple of years ago, I got approached by a organization in our field, comparative and international education. So both Nigel and I are in the same field. And they appointed me as a senior fellow under this notion of the South also knows. And they wanted people from the global South to rethink about development in a different way. And so reparations was something that I've heard about. I wasn't following CARICOM's 10-point plan. I wasn't thinking about it. I was thinking more so along my own work, which is on economic regionalism and education. And at the back, I had done work on slavery and enslavement and things like that. And when I started thinking about reparations, I also started thinking about the voices of the indigenous people in Guyana who were not part of the conversation, who still are not part of the conversation. But when I was appointed as a senior fellow at NOREG, the portfolio that I got was reparations. So I need to start to think about it. And so I was having trouble in terms of how to frame it. And so that's when I reached out to Nigel and said, I think we need to think about reparations in the context of development. And a colleague of ours had just written a piece on sort of rethinking development, and knowing Nigel's expertise in development, I reached out to him and we fleshed out a couple different ideas around sort of what reparations would look like. And I think I was drawn to working with Nigel and Nigel's work because even though we both study the Caribbean, we studied the Caribbean from different perspectives and different trajectories. And at that point in time, recently, Nigel wrote something which I found very brilliant because I had not thought about it. But he had written a piece just as I had reached out to him on this idea that the current way that the Caribbean constructs its policies, particularly the way that CARICOM is constructing its policies, is very much aligned to this notion of the ideal Caribbean citizen. But one of the things that we have done in alignment of this ideal Caribbean citizen concept, which has been around since 1997, is that we've never really talked about the colonial history in CARICOM, and we don't talk about the colonial history in our educational systems within the Caribbean. And so for me, it was both fascinating and a revolution that is true, that when we look at the way in which policy is crafted across the Caribbean, at no point in time in all the crafting of all the various things that we need to do to improve education in the Caribbean do we ever talk about the role that colonialism has played in shaping the current educative systems and some of the sort of ways in which things are there. And so when Nigel wrote this paper, and he can say what the name of the paper is, I can't remember it, but when he wrote it, I found myself, and I was writing a different paper on global citizenship in the Caribbean, and we came across this paper. I was very much enthralled by the way that he had framed this sort of lack of a historical process that Caribbean education had gone through. And so in reaching out to him to sort of think about reparations as part of my portfolio, I was really interested in how he was thinking about how we should frame development and why we should reframe development in a different way and what this development looks like. And so that is sort of what brought me to the reparations. But then after we wrote the article together, it has taken on a life of its own to the extent that it has gotten me extremely busy. And I think and Nigel is busy, so he has been involved to the point that I've actually spearheaded a working group on reparations that I work with now. And so I'm literally in the throes of writing two different things on reparations right now. For different publications. And so I've moved from not knowing anything about reparations towards sort of thinking about decoloniality, racial capitalism, and reparations and the intersection between those three things as part of a working group that I'm heading up now. And my thinking has changed a lot, which I will get into since writing this article with Nigel. And I've sort of moved to a point where I've stopped advocating for monetary reparations, and I've started advocating for something that Nigel and I touched on, but something I think that Nigel has been talking about for a very long time. And that is for us to rethink what development looks like in the Caribbean. And so because some of the writings that I'm doing now, because I have a deadline of next week, so there's a paper on reparations I'm working on, I am sort of revisiting this notion of a super fund and sort of what does a super fund can look like within the context of sort of providing some of the fundamental things that we need to engender a different type of development. And so my thinking around reparations has evolved now to sort of include a sort of a decolonial mindset, one that is structured around racial capitalism, and one that sort of looks at it and say, okay, so if we are going to think about reparations, particularly within the Caribbean context, like what does that look like? And it's a little different from CARICOM's 10-point plan. So even I'm using that to inform the writing that I'm thinking about. Is asking ourselves, is an apology enough? Do we really need the white man to apologize for things that they have refused to apologize, and can they be sincere about it? Another thing that I've noticed is that much of the discussion around reparations, because payments often come up, and The Economist just released a really interesting podcast. It was released on the 11th of November in the Economist podcast section, and one of the authors there followed a British family who had built their empire on slaves. And they follow them to Guyana, and it's a really interesting 53-minute podcast because it talks a lot about it. The point that I'm raising this is that because one of the things that the Galveston, I think it's called the Galvestons, I might be pronouncing that incorrectly, who is the family who has money in the UK and sort of can trace their ancestry back to owning a significant amount of slaves. And so one of the things that, this white man was saying is that when we think about reparations, is that the first thing that comes out of people's mouth is like, why don't I give away all of my wealth and give it to people? And I realized that in sort of looking and doing the research is that if we were to give away wealth, it would not make us any better. It would not make Black people any better. It would not make Indigenous people any better. And an apology also doesn't make us better. And so I think it's coming from the perspective of those two different things that I have now been thinking a lot about, sort of how do we invest in people and institutions in a way that gets us and allows us to get the type of development, and not just seeing reparations about paying, and just not seeing reparations about it just being something that is monetary. And I think we need to sort of move from that and from that perspective and think about how we can rethink it. And so that's sort of what I've been doing now, and this is what this article allowed me to think about, is sort of how we can rethink, epistemic reparations in a way that allows us to get beyond just sort of paying. Because I think for me, part of reparations is also going through a healing process, a process of acknowledgement and forgiveness and self-reflection. And I don't think that is often part of the reparations conversations, is that human aspect and that human element. And that's something that came to me this summer when I spent a significant portion of the summer in Ghana this year, and spending time in Ghana and sort of seeing sort of where my ancestors came from, their last bath to sort of getting to the dungeons, and then from the dungeons through the door of no return and so forth. It has really sort of shifted my thing. So this is just a long way of saying that from initially how I got here through being appointed to look at reparations, I have now sort of my mode of thinking has evolved tremendously because of these various experiences that I've had over the course of the past year, that has allowed me to start rethinking about reparations in a way that I don't think that I would have thought about it. But I also think that the way that I'm thinking about it and the way that Nigel is writing about it, it's very different from mainstream, in the sense that our starting point is not by asking for money.
Thank you. And what I'll also do is I'll put a link to the article in the chat in case anyone wants to have a look at it. And then when we talk about reparations, where really should we start? Where should we start this conversation?
Yeah. I mean, I could pick up here and just echo most of what almost everything that that Tavis just said, and just hearing, and because we haven't spoken maybe in a couple of months or so, and just hearing Tavis's movement. I'm not sure if I should call it evolution. That's up to Tavis to call it that. But I think more of a expansion of his ideas and so on. Which I find very, very really interesting. A couple of points. I understand what Tavis is saying about how we have to be, I think, realistic in our expectations of an apology. Right? It's are we really expecting it? And it might be a different question from, do we deserve an apology? And I think that's that's part of what Tavis is getting to. Do we deserve an apology? And we are referring specifically to people of African. Do we deserve an apology? Of course we do. And as Tavis pointed out, it's part of the healing process when it's a collective trauma. And I'm no psychologist, so I stay in my lane. But because that part of looking at reparation is also deeply psychological piece. And I think there are people who actually look at that. But even if it's not directly in relation to reparations, there are people who look at trauma generally, whether it's post-conflict, related to genocide, extensive abuse, and so on. And so I think we can reasonably attach it to enslavement and reparations. That part of the healing process of this trauma, is an apology from those who have been at least descendants of perpetrators and continue to benefit from the exploitation and enslavement, to the descendants who were victims. But like Tavis, should we really expect one or several? That's a difficult question. The money, and Tavis is certainly right. The money and material reparations. I mean, those are like low-hanging fruit. Honestly, that conversation has been going on for a little while, and I think it distracts from the deeper epistemic but also structural pieces. So the material piece, for example, how do you calculate over time with interest how much our forefathers' blood and foremothers' blood was worth? Extensive exploitation of and theft of land and property and all kinds of different elements. That's sort of almost low-hanging fruit at this stage, because everyone has gone over that. And the bigger piece, I think, and I think I certainly not speaking for Tavis, but I think that's what Tavis was also pointing. The bigger piece to me is the epistemic piece, the cultural piece, the piece around trauma, the piece around how the globe and the international system is structured now, where there is continued exploitation, and that exploitation, the structure that has been set for that, is largely as a result of power that had been gained through enslavement and enrichment from that era. So the questions for me and the focus for me around reparations would be, what about our lost histories, our lost voice, our lost ways of knowing, our ways of different ways of constructing knowledge? And I say ways because Africans constituted many different societies and systems, and they are not all one people. The problem of the nation state has suggested, has made us put ourselves into little corners. But so the part of this issue then is, how do we retain or regain that right and regard for our own systems? Because you look around the world now, and most things Black or of African descent is often viewed as somewhere at the bottom in terms of regard and esteem, and that has come through a long process of racialization, racism. And how do we recover those? How do we recover a sense of historical, cultural, epistemic pride? How do we deal with the trauma? How do we reconstruct the ways the world is structured in such a way that we are no global South countries, countries from the Caribbean, countries from Africa, are not so subject to the whims and fancies of the powers of the global North, majority Western white nations. Those are the questions that I am more concerned about, and the degree of autonomy that countries, people of African descent have in shaping their own destinies. That's the direction, or those are the types, the directions that I see my work in reparations going, and less about, yes, I think the material component is important, and I wouldn't say it should not be done. It certainly should be part of the conversation and part of the structure going forward. But there's a whole other piece that is often not sufficiently engaged with or addressed. I'll just end here. I'm not even sure I answered your original question.
I agree with what Nigel is saying. So I think we need to be realistic. The last figure that said that the money that Britain owes to the Caribbean, it stands at how many? A trillion, and the figure that I remember says it's 9 times the current GDP of the UK. There is absolutely nowhere we're going to get that. Nowhere. That's not going to happen. I mean, Rishi Sunak recently said that he will not, in his words, we will not cherry pick our history. That's what he said to the British Parliament recently. And so when you have people like that and like him in power who is sort of thinking in a similar way, particularly it's even more shocking that a person of color would talk about that. So it sort of puts him as a we versus them scenario. But when you have people who are sort of thinking about that way because they recognize that at the end of the day is going to bankrupt the capitalist system, we can't be putting that as at front and center. And so when it comes to material reparations, in my opinion, is that we have to be willing to take what it is that we're going to get, and we're not going to get a lot. And so the question then becomes is, how do we do the best that we can do with the little that we are going to get? And so that is why I think we were starting to say that we do need to invest it into our institutions, into our educational systems, and sort of bring them to a point that can drive and generate success. But here's the problematic part. And this is why I have now started linking decoloniality to reparations, is that we have become accustomed to functioning within a Western system that is driven by white supremacy. And so the way that we're defining success is based on Western ideas and Western morals, and not necessarily based on indigenous ways and knowing and thinking that our ancestors would have thought about. That's also problematic. So when we talk about investing in education, the question then becomes in terms of what type of education should we invest in? Are we investing in Western ways of educative experiences that would only further develop capitalism and make the wealthy even more wealthier? Or are we talking about ways in which we can sort of bring back, and I think this is what Nigel is getting at, bring back sort of indigenous knowledge and indigenous knowledges, indigenous ways of knowing, and helping us to sort of understand what it is that our ancestors view as important. And so when I look at the decolonial literature and the way that I start thinking about how one decolonizes their own praxis, is about the ways in which we think about what it is that our ancestors would have left to us and how we can regain that. And so we also should recognize, as Miglot rightfully says, that, that there would be no modernity without coloniality, and coloniality is the darker side of modernity. I think we need to think about the way we think about reparations. And I would argue that material reparations is the darker side of capitalism, in the sense that if we're forcing for material reparations, what in essence we're doing is reinforcing capitalism in a way that allows us to continue along a consumerist ways of thinking in that consumerist economy that is driven by capitalism. So giving people a handout, as many have called it, is just asking them towards contributing more to a capitalist economy by making those who are already wealthy wealthier. And so the question then becomes is, how do we take the knowledge that we have and reinvest that knowledge in a way that allows for those who've been trampled on, who've been stifled, who have not had access, whose voices are not part of the conversation? How do we lift them up in a way that gets to us where we can start thinking about senses or instances of equality? And so for me, reparations represents a way in which we can think about a equitable and just system that we can design. It's a way where we can think about uplifting the voices and the consciousness of people who aren't necessarily aware of what that is. So it's not just about the money per se. It's about how do we engender different type of development. And just like how there are different types of globalizations, I would also say that there are different types of development. And it's not just about giving the Caribbean money so they can look like the West. I think once we say that, we're sort of missing the point. We don't want the Caribbean to look like the West. We want the Caribbean to go through its genuine sense of development, and it should develop along the lines which it thinks that should be equitable based upon what its peoples want. And so with capitalism and with the fall of the Berlin Wall, so not the Berlin Wall, so with the fall of communism per se, we have only engendered one type of development. And reparations, I would argue, allows us to think about different types of development. And so, for example, capitalism is not the only way. We have to think about different types of developmental models that can lead to larger ecological change that can get us out of where we are right now. And in essence, the saying is simple. We can be using the masters' tools to build our own houses. We've got to come up with our own tools to build houses that suits us. And maybe modern glass structures are not what we need, and maybe we do need to go back to huts when it comes to the type of development that will sort of make Africans of who come from enslaved people, when we look at what it is that we would like to make and contribute, maybe that's sort of where we need to be. And so for me, when we focus on the reparations, the whole point of reparatory justice sort of misses it, because it focuses solely, and I can't help but keep repeating this, because it focuses solely on our Western knowledge systems and Western ways of thinking. And we must conclude, given everything that we're facing, from Palestine to global warming, the West is not right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I certainly would echo a lot of what Tavis just said, particularly as we sort of idealize the modernist capitalist system we have as the ultimate in the good life, and almost an inability to see and envision alternatives, and that's fundamentally part of the challenge. And so one of the things we have to admit is that there are many people in the Caribbean, on the African continent, in the US, elsewhere, people of African descent, who do see the good life as part of as a capitalist system, and that's part of the challenge. And how do we develop systems, way of communication, schooling, education, that can help us to imagine alternatives and to sort of move away from this Western white gaze, where everything that is defined as good is represented by this Westernness. And that's a challenge. That's a challenge, because you are fundamentally talking about changing how people think and their value system. And so this is where and this is why I consider the epistemic and the cultural re-envisioning a greater part of the project of reparations than the material component. And I'm not, I would say I disagree, but I have a slight perspective than Tavis when it comes to the money component, because I do think the West should, and in our case, Britain should pay us material recompense, reparations, because unfortunately the world is structured so much along. You can't do anything much without money. And even if we were to design new systems, new educational frameworks, because of how the global economic system is functioning, how you fund stuff, how you train people, so much of that is dependent on material capacities, right? And unfortunately, we may have to engage with some part of the evil empire structure in order to undo it. So in some cases, we may have to use the master's tool to build a different house. But our capacity to build that different house is gonna have to come through our capacity to envision something different. That, if there are tools, they can be used to do different things, not just one thing, So that's part of the epistemic reparation that we need to do to repair the damage that has been done to our psyche and how we think of constructing the world. And one last bit, because I know I'm, talking a bit here, but one of the emerging, I wouldn't say emerging, but it's gaining much more focus as a discourse now is around, and Tavis mentioned it, it's around ecological issues, the environment, climate change. And we can't forget that climate, the problem we have found ourselves in, this existential problem, was fundamentally a function of modernity. You can look at all the scientific data, or at least the most important ones and most significant ones, and you will see that much of the most harmful gases that we have been putting into the environment, and the pollution and the environment, started around the Industrial Revolution. And who did that benefit the most? It was Western Europe and the United States ultimately, right? And now, of course, China and others are coming up. But fundamentally, the greatest damage that has been done to our environment came out of the capitalist enterprise, by Westerners, by Europeans, Western Europeans, and by the US, and they are the ones who have primarily benefited. The data also shows that the people who are most affected by climate change are people of color, right? Are people living in the global South, places like the Caribbean and so on, right? So when we talk about reparations too, one of the single greatest challenge of our time is climate change. And we talk about things like notions of resilience and adaptation and so on. Because Western nations, especially Western right nations, they have the money and they can put in place these adaptation measures to cope with the challenge that they themselves created in the first place. And yet, if you look at the COP, the Conference of Parties, I think it's the thing, it's going on, or the 28th version, COP 28 is taking place. Reparations have been brought up, have been pushed significantly by global South nations, and it is constantly resisted by the US, people from Western Europe, because they don't want to engage not subsidizing, but engage in addressing the problems of climate change and the difficulties that the global South faces, right? It was only COP21 that they accepted some form of, and they use this technical term about some like loss and damage or something or the other. But that's not the retrospect, as far as I know. I'm not a climate policy person, so people can go and double check on that. But it's not retrospective, so it's not reparations. It's like what's happening now and what will happen in the future. So they are resisting issues around reparations, around climate change, and it is proven that they are more responsible for climate change than anyone else, right? So even as new discourses come up, we have to also be able to target notions of reparations around these new development movements, and we shouldn't miss these opportunities to ensure that we use a collective voice in sounding out the need for reparations and the responsibility that Western nations have to, in this case, people of African descent and other people of color as well. But they do have significant monetary responsibility and epistemic responsibility as well. And it's one thing to just look at some of the material component around slavery and so on, but a lot of that was also tied in the environment and the exploitation of the environment, and which people from the global South are experiencing in the most negative fashion now.
Maybe we also, if you could also say something about modernity, about the European, Western, American imperial colonial project, the extractivism, and people of African descent. What did they do? What did this imperial colonial project do to African people, to people of African descent, in terms of how these Western epistemologies, constructed and framed African people, and also the effect that those constructs have now?
Well, I mean, the thing about the colonial project, or let me rephrase that, the thing about the modernity project is that I said earlier on, coloniality is the darker side of modernity, in the sense that without colonialism, there would be no modernization, there would be no capitalism that we have today. And I think that's often we forget that. And so it's interesting that we've been willing to pay. So let's not mince words. Reparations is not something new. It's not something that has never happened. It's not something that is like out of the blue. In various stages, reparations have been paid.
Joints. Now £6 per kilo.
Reparations has been paid when France demanded reparations from Haiti when Haiti sought independence. When there was the Japanese internment, reparations was paid for that. Reparations were paid to the Jews. Reparations were demanded from Germany after World War I under the Treaty of Versailles. So there are numerous instances of reparations. For me, the problem is, so Nigel, I'm not saying that I'm not saying that we don't want money from Britain. I just feel as though that we're just wasting our time trying to get it, because it's not going to happen. That's sort of how I feel, because it's not going to happen. Would I like it to happen? Of course I would like it to happen, but I just don't think it's going to happen. And so my problem is, and this goes back to colonialism, enslavement, and everything else that we've talked about, is like all the other groups who have gotten reparations were not Black. So the other groups who were able to successfully fought for reparations were not Black. And so for me, it goes back to this question of race. Why it is that when Black people are asking for reparations, there's this big controversy about paying it. I mean, there are a couple of exceptions in the US, like in Evanston, Chicago, where I live, where they set up a reparations funds where they're giving, if you're able to show that you're a descendant of a slave, you get a $25,000 grant towards buying a house. But when we sort of look at other big global reparations movements, particularly around slavery, it's like slavery is like the dirty secret that nobody wants to talk about. And so particularly when you think about what is going on in the West now, so you think about the impact that the Black Lives Movement had globally, and it sort of draw attention to some of the injustices that Black people have suffered. And we sort of think about how that movement has sort of like fizzled out a little bit. And then we think about what is going on now in Palestine, and we think about all the discussion and the discourse around anti-Semitism. And the question is, how it is that one group who have suffered equally to other groups over the course of history, but yet one group who just happens to be white is able to dominate the discourse and the conversation much more than the group that happens to be Black. And so when you sort of question that, and that's what my students keep asking me, how it is that the momentum gained from the BLM hasn't been able to sort of spark the type of change, but yet the type of condemnation, for example, that the U.S. Congress has had around anti-Semitism. How it is that we didn't have that type of condemnation around sort of Black Lives Matter movement, around policing and things like that. And so for me, that goes back, and it sort of shows that yet again, a group that looks predominantly a certain way, what we might be categorized as white, and you look at the way in which they're being able to get things in a heightened era right now, and you look about what happens with the BLM movement not so long ago, a couple years ago, and sort of what has happened. And so for me, that says that only, I think, further sort of backs up the point that I'm making, that we may want material reparations, but it's not going to happen anytime soon. And that for me goes back to the way in which Black people are viewed globally. Whether we like it or not, we are still viewed as lesser than anything else. We know that race is a social construct. We know that race has been used in many instances to make programs and plans, everything from redlining to Jim Crow to segregation, etc. We know all these things, but yet at the end of the day, as I tell my students, a Black man walks down the street in a hoodie and a sweatpants, and a white woman clutches her purse, because that's the perception that they have of Black people. And so that has not changed. And so when we are going to, even before we start thinking about reparations and who is to be given money, whether it's material or non-material and things like that, we haven't addressed the systematic concerns that have come about from enslavement, slavery, and colonization. And that is the idea that people think of Black people as being still less than human. And that the fact that they still have issues with Black people, the fact that you have so many people who are still racist towards Black people. And those are some of the fundamental truths that have emerged through the colonial project, through the modernity project, is the way in which we've sort of targeted and categorized Black people as a way that we treat them different. In the US, we talk about the prison to the school to prison pipeline. That's a real thing. And so if a white person can't accept that their actions is based on something that's real, then that's problematic. If white people don't understand that because of white privilege, the access to the things that they have that makes their life comfortable has been borne upon the backs of Black people, that's problematic. If white people can't accept that their country is built upon slavery and enslavement, is built upon human chattel and selling bodies, selling Black bodies, that's problematic. And if they can't respect a Black body, that's also problematic. And so for me, when we talk about slavery and enslavement, we're not just talking about things that are of a bygone era that our ancestors suffer. And I think that for me is part of the problem with the reparations movement, is that we make it seem as though, or the way that it's contextualized is that it's contextualized that we're paying for things of the past, for sins of the past. And I would argue that no, we're paying for sins of the current, and we're paying for the sins of the future that we will make. And that's, for me, is what makes reparations so important, is because it's not just about the past and the things that have been done about the past. It's the ways in which these things in the past have been done that have ultimately structured our reality. It has structured our conceptualization as to what the future is that we're living within. And so without the things that our ancestors had gone through and suffered, we would not have this type of future where we're concerned about climate change, where we're concerned about wars and things like that. And so the last point I want to make, when you talk about the utter disrespect and disregard for the Black body, is that before the war in Palestine started, we had wars on the African continent that have been raging left, right, and center. A genocide has been going on in Sudan and in Ethiopia, and famine. We have all these things that were going on well before Palestine. We had the summer of coups across Africa. Did any Western nation step in and say that they were going to put how many billions of dollars to stop that, in the same way that Western nations are stepping in to support Israel and to support Ukraine? Have they stepped in similar ways towards saying that we're going to offer that support to Africa, or to help sort of solve some of the other wars that are raging around the world? And for me, that speaks volumes in the sense, again, when you think about the way that things are framed. Another example, the Ukraine war is touching 2 years, but when 3 summers before the Ukraine war was there, we talk about the European migrant crisis, right? And when the Ukraine war started, it was the European refugee crisis. That change in discourse, that tone in discourse speaks volumes to it. So when I say that we just sort of hoping that maybe a check may come, is because I'm looking at what humanity has done. I'm looking at humanity's actions and reactions to things over the last 100 years. And the way in which they have responded to things, it continues to say that white is right and black is insignificant.
Yeah. And Ambrose, I know you had asked about the epistemic piece. And I mean, there's a whole litany of places we could go with this. We could think about the role of religion, because religion was significantly important in the colonial project, and religion was seen as a way of making civilized the backward natives, and converting Black people was seen as a way of saving them. That's fundamentally a statement on how African spirituality was viewed, right? Whether they're organized religion or different ways of different ways of worshiping, different views on deity and so on. That is one epistemic piece, and that is a big one. The Christian conversion of Africans, of Black people. That was a significant justification for enslavement and abuse. And there were a lot of contradictions around that as well, because even with the conversion, even after conversion, the interpretation of the Bible, pretty much was done in such a way that it would place Black people in servitude till eternity. This notion of the curse of Ham, right? Some of us are familiar with that. This idea that one of Noah's son came in and saw him naked, and in return, Noah cursed his grandson to a lifetime of servitude and slavery. And it is assumed that this grandson who Ham was cursed is a forefather of Black people, and that was an interpretation. So we have to think of religion even as an epistemic piece, because religion devalued the religious ideas and ways of worship of different African societies and peoples. If we think about, and so we have to think about religion as a part of this. If you look at one of the most dominant religion, it's not the most, not in terms of the population of religion, but in terms of its influence, right? Capitalism itself is highly tied up with Christianity, right? So religion is one. We can think about the ideas that have informed and produced modern Western universities, and areas of study. Anthropology, right? Anthropology was significant in how Black people were understood or perceived, right? Early anthropology work, right, were significant in shaping people's views of the Black body, their sexuality, how they behave, their social systems, and so on. And so anthropology was a significant, played significant role. And many other religions, philosophy, there was a belief that Africans had no philosophy, they had no history. People who are, a lot of these areas of study now, disciplines, were developed from deeply racist backgrounds. We think about people like Immanuel Kant and others who were seen as foundations of modern disciplines. Yet the university is built around, the university disciplines I built a modern universities. I built around some of these same ideas. They will tell you that they have gone through significant evolutions and they have changed and they have become much more critical, right? Now we can be the judge of that. And so the call for decoloniality and decolonization is an important component of the reparations movement. We might not always link them as such, but they have deep relations. If we think about the science, and science was significant in framing this idea that Black people were inferior, right? If you think about things like the publications like the Crania Americana, so scientific racism, out of which eugenics, eugenics is a part of scientific racism. Science was in for significant amount of time was dedicated to proving that Black people were not fully humans. That is another significant epistemic component. And even now, when science has disproved these, gone back and said, oh, my bad, we were wrong. Actually, there is no scientific justification for scientific basis for race. The remnants are still there, right? If we think about the cultural component and this elevation of Western European cultures, right? So people will look at, for example, classical music now, and they will view this as the ultimate of sophistication. And many, Black music, African-inspired music, even though they may be popular, they still struggle for that type of high culture recognition, right? That is an epistemic piece, right? So much of the knowledge systems, culture, religion, a lot of that, which all of these go into how a people is viewed, how they are ranked. All of these systems were dedicated at some point extensively towards the degradation of Black people, right? Many of these systems have been woven into our universities or systems of higher learning. And in many ways, they still reflect these tensions, even if as they try to reform. And we're all part, most of us, I think, here are part of universities. We know how difficult they are to change, try getting a change in a course title and you see how many committees it has to go through, right? So these systems are deeply resilient, right? And it takes a lot to undo them, to reform them. And we also have to see these systems as part of the process of that should be subject to systems of reparations, discussions around reparations. What is taught in universities? Whose voice is dominant? What is seen as worthwhile knowledge? How we do research? Whose knowledge is validated, and so on.
Maybe before we take questions from people who are present, maybe if you could say something about the education system in the Caribbean, how it developed, and also where it is now and how it needs to change. And then we take questions from the audience and then come back.
So that's a great question. I know Tavis can jump in whenever he wants, but your education system was largely built from colonial origins. When the British established their plantations and eventually, built families and created their slave societies, when education came to the Caribbean, it was not for the enslaved people. It was not for Black people. It was for the planters' children who, if the planters weren't rich enough, they couldn't send back their kids to England to get educated, because that's not how that's how it would normally be done. If you're really rich and then, you send back your kids to England to get them educated. Education in the Caribbean first was started for that population, those who really couldn't return, to at least send their kids back to England to get educated, right? The planters did not look kindly on educating the slaves, the enslaved people. Yes, you had the Christians and the, what do you call them now? Who wanted to educate the enslaved people, because if you can't convert someone to Christianity if you can't read the Bible. And so there was always this tension between the planters and those religious Christian folks. Eventually when education was extended to mulattoes, as they call them then, these were the offsprings of of enslaved people, mostly enslaved women, and we haven't even talked about the sexual exploitation yet. These were offsprings of, the mulattoes were offsprings of usually Black enslaved women and sexual predators, white sexual predators. And so, they were the first ones of the non-whites, for want of a better term, who gained some form of education, because the white fathers still wanted to give them some privilege, right? So but even when this education was developed, it was not an education that was developed largely, drawing from the needs of the local population, even when it eventually spread to the enslaved near just about the time when emancipation was taking place or about to take place. That education was largely drawn from working class education in England. So working class education in England was a sort of second class education compared to the more privileged upper class. And so people in the Caribbean, the enslaved, got actually a third class education, if you put it that. And it was about British history. It was about British ideas, British ways of knowing, right? There was no education that was reflective of the needs of the local Black or mulatto population, right? So the education was largely built on colonialism and colonial ideas. And these ideas informed, and it was very elitist as well, in terms of both the remnants are still there. Those who could access education, then you had the colorism. Those who could access education were based on skin shade, so the whites were more privileged, the mulattoes next, and the Black, you could say the fully Black people were, or the recently enslaved, were the ones who were at the bottom, and they would have access to the lowest quality of education. And throughout the history of the Caribbean, that has largely entailed, at least the Anglophone Caribbean, for decades, centuries after. Even now, to a great extent, education is good education. So-called good education is a function of privilege, and oftentimes that runs along the lines of skin shade and so on. And so the emergence of and development of education in the Caribbean was racialized and racist. And even with many attempts to reform the system, in many cases, all we had is a change of name, change of title of schools and so on. But the basic system of how we view education, what we study, how we study, and so on, and the type of knowledge we focus on, whose interests is centered in the education system. Those are still very outward looking, and we still, in many ways, even now, when we have made so many revisions and reforms to the education system, we still suffer from the Western gaze, the Western white gaze. And as Tavis intimated earlier on, our education system is functionally, our education system really is about how you fit into the modern capitalist economy. One of the famous things in one of the major reform documents, which Tavis can remember, is that we're not educating our citizens just for the Caribbean. We're educating citizens for the world. And that's a fundamental, it may seem like it's a good thing. We are just educating people for the world, but that has some fundamental problems, because is the world reflective of the Caribbean? Does the world have the interest of the Caribbean history, current challenges at heart? So education itself is one of the most significant areas that needs to be reformed, addressed, and an era that must be considered under the broad ambit of reparations, which is something we talk about in that article which we wrote.
We can go into questions. I'm just cognizant of the time rather than me speaking at length again.
I don't know does anyone have a question? If you've got a question, if you unmute and yeah, you can put your question. Yeah, carry on.
Hi, I'm Celine Vary from Berlin, and I work on decolonization and gender, but more regarding African context. And I was interested in this question of the future, what kind of future do we want to see? And because we spoke also a lot about capitalism, maybe also socialism would be important. To have a different economic model that we strive for, and it was actually one of the options, right? And independence and all of that, and it was super important in the visions for future for Black people and African people. So what do you think about that? And and maybe also the question of gender. Do we work on that, or what place then? Thanks.
Maybe we take two more. Does anyone have another question? Okay, I think people are happy. We go with Celine's question. Yes.
Hi, thank you very much for your interventions, Professor Jules and Professor Brissett. I'm based at UCL, Institute of the Americas, also working on demands for reparations, comparing demands in Latin America and the Caribbean. So this talk was very informative and interesting. And the question I have, I suppose, Professor Jules, you were alluding to it, where you were referring to the Economist's podcast, and perhaps it was with the Trevelyan family who are making amends in Grenada, I'm not sure. But the core I'm hearing in these discourses is the importance of education, which has also been coming up in my research. And the Trevelyan family have, paid reparations by donating to strengthen education systems in the Caribbean. So I was wondering, whether the reparations that you see improving structures in the Caribbean should go towards education. And somebody else in the chat has also written about the curriculum. So I'm keen to know how else education can be transformed in the Caribbean as a form of reparatory justice.
And also, Alan, did you want to put your comments to the speaker?
Yeah. Thanks, Ambrose. what I was referring to really was, in terms of the reparations, if it could actually be in with systemic initiatives that aim to reform institutions or policies that perpetuate the legacy of slavery and colonialism. Because I mean, I'm from Zimbabwe, and I always see, not only in UK, but in many Commonwealth countries, statues of people who colonialize us. So essentially, colonialism is still alive. And what Shona said, we could also consider revising curricula and textbooks that are taught to our children. Yeah, that's what I wanted to say.
I can start with a couple of them. Actually, no, I was referring to the family in Guyana, not Grenada. I'm blanking on the name right now. But when I think about reparations being used for education and policy development, I think that the money has to be used in a way that develops indigenous knowledge systems that allows us to sort of think about the way we can promote alternatives to capitalism and alternatives to the current world. So, for example, an investment in education from a reparations super fund for me would be something like, how do we develop Caribbean artists? How do we develop Caribbean English Creole? Or when you talk about it as Caribbean patois, how do we develop science and technology that is organic and relevant to Caribbean economies in a way that would allow for them to be able to be successfully developed, however they define development, which is a completely different thing and beyond the scope of this discussion. And so for me, it's not just about an investment in education, because I don't want the educational system to produce people who can only function in Western society. Or function in the current version of modernity. I want the educational system to be able to give them the tools and the opportunities to construct their own version of what modernity can look like, to construct their own version of capitalism, or to think about ways in which they might reinvent capitalism or make capitalism better or make capitalism more humane. We've started talking about about making capitalism more humane as we've been talking about this notion of reglobalization. And quickly, reglobalization is the idea that there are different versions of globalization, and we can find one that is more ecologically balanced, that doesn't sort of have an extractive way of being, thinking, acting, and feeling, which is similar to extractive colonialism. And so for me, it's not just that we need to invest in education, is that we need to invest into types of education that are not only sustainable, but in types of education that will bring about a different world. We cannot continue to live in the world that we live in. We cannot continue to consume in the ways that we're consuming, because we don't have another 100 years on this planet if we keep doing the things that we're doing. And so for me, education is not just an investment in education. It's an investment in a way to help us to say, for the past couple hundreds of years, we've done modernity the way that the West wanted to do it. Let's try doing modernity a different way. And says, how do we invest to get about that difference, to help us to think about what it is that African societies, African peoples can be able to contribute to a world that is basically just going the way that it's going because it's white. And so when I think about the investment of education, for me, it's troubling, because then it raises lots of questions. Who is going to teach whom? What does that education look like? And all these other things. And so part of it is also just sort of thinking about what it is we want. What is the role, scope, and function of education? And I think we need to challenge that today, because our educational systems with their hidden curricula are just simple systems that continue to perpetuate white supremacist structures in a way that gets what it wants to get from us. We are just extractive bodies that are there towards providing labor for capitalism, and we're exploited, and we pay this thing we call a wage, and then we hope that we can that this wage will allow us to consume and buy things that we don't really need to buy, and then we just sort of don't care anymore about it. And that's what our educational system teaches us. The question then becomes is, how do we restructure education where it goes to the collectively and fundamentally, where it starts teaching us about the collective notion of we as we as a society, as opposed to teaching us about I as an individual. And so when I talk about capitalism to my students, I say capitalism has done you a great job of teaching you about the I, but where's the collective we? And so you mentioned socialism, and maybe socialism is not the term we want to throw around, but we might want to think about, how do we become our brothers and sisters keepers? How do I do things that can help and better humanity in a way that engenders the type of things, the types of being that have responsibilities that I feel as though that is important? And by brothers and sisters keepers here, I'm not going to a sense of religiosity here. I'm just talking about a simple sense of being human and expressing a form of humanity that can ultimately have ripple effects that can change the way we think about things. And so for me, when we talk about true reparations, this is why I started off by saying, do we really need an apology? And you think of it in the context of your relationship, do you apologize when you're angry? Do you apologize when you are dismissive? Do you apologize when you're like antagonistic? Or do you apologize when there's a sense of sincerity to get there? And so for me, I'm willing to accept an apology when I think it's sincere. And I think we're far from being sincere because we don't treat each other like humans. We don't treat each other in the way that we need to be treated. And so I go back to Rishi Sunak's comments when he talks about cherry picking history. If his point is that we shouldn't cherry pick history to determine sort of good and bad, then we are far away in terms of where we are, because I'm not asking you to cherry pick your history. I'm simply asking you to think about what you're doing today. And everything that you're doing today is a reflection of the past that you've had, a past that my ancestors have contributed towards giving you. The privilege that you have to be able to do that is built upon the backs of my ancestors. And I'm just asking you to not apologize for that, but just to acknowledge. And for me, the acknowledgement is the beginning of something that can lead towards an apology. And an apology is far from there, because I just don't want an apology for the sake of an apology. I want an apology because you feel as though that you have been treated unequally in a similar manner that you recognize how I've been treated for years. And you can relate to that, and we can start our reconciliation from that point. And so when I think about education, is that is the type of lessons that our educative systems need to teach, not just about sort of making money, spending money, and happiness is a white picket fence. That's not what it is, or that you sell your labor and you call it a wage. That's not what our education system is. And so part of the fundamental part of it too is that we also need to rethink the role, scope, and function of education. What is the purpose of education? What is the raison d'etre of education? What should we be getting out of an education? And we'll quickly realize that much of the education system doesn't address the history. We don't talk about the history in a way that we should talk about it, and we don't address it. And if we do talk about it, it's glossed over, and we quickly try to find solutions, because capitalism tells us that we need to sort of talk about the instantaneous gratification, about the applicability of to now. Whereas we are not told that we need to sort of sit with our feelings and sort of understand and process things, but we're told that it needs to be instantaneous. And for me, that's also problematic with education. So it's not just about reforming education, it's also about thinking, what is the purpose of education and what it should be? And more importantly, is education the right starting point for this? It may not necessarily be the right starting point. It's where we would like to start, but it doesn't mean that there can't be other starting points. And finally, is that we just can't have education alone. We need to think about this as sort of several parallel streams and tracks that are going together, and they're going to ultimately reach at a fork. What those parallel streams and tracks are, I can't say, but I certainly am open to thoughts and welcome thoughts and comments about how we can complement our re-envisionment of our educational system as we think about what it is that we're asking for.
Yeah. I mean, I just want to quickly echo a lot of what Tavis discussed around a re-envisioning of education, because as we, even as Tavis pointed out earlier on, my entire work is pretty much on, in some way or another, on that, and how we have been envisioning educational change in the Caribbean, and questioning this very, very capitalist, market-oriented, individualistic approach to education. That's fundamentally what my work around educational reform in the Caribbean is. So I won't even bother to go and say everything again that Tavis said, just to endorse what he said. In fact, I would say the other thing I would add, and I think it was somewhat intimated by Tavis, but I'm going to take that in a slightly not a different direction, but expand it a bit. And it is this idea that exploitation is relational, right? One does not exploit oneself, right? There is one party that exploits and the other is exploited. And we have to understand that to reduce and limit exploitation is not just dependent on one party, right? In this case, the wronged or the exploited. We also have to find, how do we get the person who's doing the exploitation, who's performing the exploitation, to change those actions. And I think this is what we have to think about when we also think about a question, I'm not sure if it was, I can't remember who asked it. I think it might have been, was it the first person who asked? I'm sorry, I forgot the name. But how do we find ways to create this system of understanding and empathy and change? And I think that comes through the education system as well, right? How do we ensure that not just people of color, not just Black people, understand the travesty and the continued exploitation of colonialism, enslavement, and that whole capitalist project? It's also white students in the North understanding this system historically as well, because they do have a lot of power. And I think we have a newer set of young people now who respond to social justice causes in significantly different ways than previously, right? And I think, and so even the decolonization of the curriculum in universities in the West, that's an important component of moving the reparations needle, because the greater mass of people we have who understand the history of exploitation, of enslavement, of colonialism, right? The bigger mass of people we have understanding that, the more mass of people we have willing to say, actually, let's take a second look at how we treat each other here. Let's take a second look at how we structure the system. Let's take a second look at what we learn, what we consider knowledge, what we consider reasonable behavior, and how do we change this? How do we put pressure on our own governments to change this, this system? So I think that's important. And the question that Alan asked is actually a good question. I thought I'd mentioned it, but somehow I think it, I don't think I elaborated on that. One of the important components for me in reparations is, how do we restructure the economic system? And we do mention that in the article we are referring to, Tavis and I wrote. How do we, but taking that further, not just the aid system, systems of trade, right? Systems of refugee resettlement, and how that is dominated by certain ideas around belonging, right? So trade, refugee, migration. Let's not forget that colonialism was also, was a form of illegal migration in the terms of, why people go in places where they did not belong and stole land that did not belong to them and did things to other people that they should not have done. So let's not forget about that as well. And we shouldn't forget that in our history when we talk about modern migration policy, right? So as we move forward, we have to think about these systems of trade, international migration, economic taxation system. There's so much we need to talk about, that the international system that continues to squeeze nations from the global south, which are largely people of color, continue to squeeze these countries out of even being able to make a life, even this weird, uneven capitalist system, right? Even within the existing system, even before we reform it, just the existing system, which is so unbalanced and unfair. If we were to change some of that structure, as which is what Alan is getting to, that's also somewhere we need to look at as well. WTO, how the World Bank functions, how the IMF functions, how we can impose structural adjustment programs at its will, and so on. So there is a lot to be done there. The last point that was asked, and we often leave gender out of the conversation, probably because we three men are the ones who are largely driving the discussion. There's, and not to suggest that gender is just about women, because gender is so much more, but there's a lot of gender work that is taking place in the Caribbean. I'm not sure how much around reparations, but there's a lot of gender work that we really need to look at, and how exploitation in the past, around slavery affected women especially, but also how the modern capitalist system, which has drawn extensively in its exploitative system approaches from the colonial and enslavement system, how it also continues to disempower women of color, and especially Black women. Right. I know we are out of time now, so let me just stop here. A lot more to say, but I'll just hand it back over to Ambrose.
Well, on time, do you have time for a few more questions? Or
yes, I do. I don't know if Tavis has to go, but I think I can do a couple more.
Yes, I can take a couple more questions that then I have to leave after that for another appointment.
Okay. So before we get to the questions, Celine, Alan, and Shadona, do you want to respond to what Tavis and Nigel have said? If you just unmute and say what's on your mind.
Yes, I just wanted to come back in on what Professor Jules spoke about essentially reimagining new ways of educational structures, and this has definitely been coming up in my own PhD research, and I put there in the chat, especially from a Latin American perspective, the thinking around ethnic education and really centering curriculum and teaching around indigenous and African indigenous knowledges, right? Afro-epistemologies. So yes, I'm basically in agreement with what you were saying. And in my research in Jamaica, which is my focus, from the Caribbean, many people were suggesting focusing on, not many people, but people with specific perspectives were talking about the importance of Garveyism, really including that in the curriculum, for example, and Rastafari beliefs, tying in with Professor Brissett's talking about the importance of religion as well in education. So I just wanted to add those.
Thank you. How about you, Alan?
Yeah, thanks. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I love Nigel's connection of decoloniality to the current day refugee crisis, or rather the refugee world that we're living in at the moment. And unfortunately, it seems as if this is only applying to the first world, as it were. For the global south, nothing is changing, because as far as, at least as far as I'm concerned, those systems that are still oppressing, they are still operative, even if, for example, even if there isn't colonialism anymore. I always go back to the example of Zimbabwe, which is where I'm from. Even if the Black people are now in charge, we still have got a colonial system that is gripping the whole education system, the political system. So all it has done is just changed the color of the people who are in power. But in terms of oppression of the normals of the ordinary citizen, that is still going on. And it's sad because whenever I think of reparations in most of these global south countries, if it is to be paid in monetary terms, those monies will be squandered. So I love the fact that we may be considering changing the systems instead of just giving money to an elite within a country. If there is a way that we can see that such reparations, they have an effect on the grassroots level, I think that would be a way forward. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alan. And then Abigail and Hannah, did you want to speak to your questions? If you just unmute and okay, so we come back to you, Nigel and Tavis. Do you have like final comments, thoughts, things that you want to emphasize, pick up on as we wind down?
That's a good question, actually. I think I've said most of what I need to say, but I would say, as we think about reparations, and I think the way that Nigel and I are thinking, because we haven't spoken in a couple of months, as we've said, so it's interesting that we've been going through different processes and we've both arrived at similar conclusions. I think we need to pay attention to the type of society that we want, and we need to have a vision as to what might be best for the next generations to come. And I think reparatory justice is about one way that this can occur. It's not the only way, and it cannot occur in isolation, and it has to occur in conjunction with other things. And so as we think about the reparations movement globally, and we think fundamentally about what it is seeking to get going, or what it's seeking to do, it's importantly, I think, that we also offer our own personal reflections and our own sense of guidance, particularly as people of African descent, and ask ourselves what it is that we would like to have. Because at the end of the day, it's about how I view reparations as how it affects you individually. For some of us, that might be an apology. For some of us, it might be material things. For some of us, it might be how we can be better brothers and sisters keepers to the rest of humanity. And so I think the reparations debate offers us the opportunity to be self-reflective and think about the types of humans that we would like to be, and what does this mean sincerely for not only for humanity, but for us. And if we are going to start with an apology, what does that apology mean? If we are going to think about material reparations, what can that materiality buy? And for me, part of this is about thinking about how do we sort of construct a society that is not going to be able to do the things that were done before. And I think perhaps one of the things that I am most disappointed at in humanity is the concept of never again. And so we're talking about reparations for enslaved African Americans, enslaved Africans, African Americans, and people of African descent. And I would not be surprised if in 5, 10, or 15 years from now, we'll be talking about reparations for Palestinians. And so when I say that I'm disappointed in humanity, and I'm disappointed in the concept of never again, is that if we were serious, we've had 50 plus years since the last atrocity, 30 plus years since the Bosnian Wars, another 30 plus years since the Rwandan genocide. And these are all been sort of pivotal points around human rights and around history. And when we think about saying never again, the question is, as a species, do we really mean never again? Do we really mean that, or will we be in a similar position not so long from now arguing for something similar? And I say that only to have us to sort of think and put this into a global perspective, because I would argue that reparations, like the purpose of this gathering here, is one of many, many other things that we need to sort of think about. And while it's good to sort of think about it in isolation, the potential benefits that it could bring about, it's also important to place it within the context of some of the broader things that are going on globally. And so we can't just isolate and talk about reparations without talking about climate change and genocide and all these other things. We have to take them into context with each other. And so my final message would be, is as we think about the type of world we would like to live in, let's think about how best we can support our brothers and sisters in making that happen.
Thank you. Thank you. And Nigel?
Yeah, I would echo a lot of what Tavis said, especially the lack of human empathy for each other. The second thing I would say is that it's important to have more fora like this in different places at different times, because these conversations and the knowledge we share need to take place more widely, more often. That's how we can do public education about these issues, not just within the hollowed walls of the universities, but it's important to, put this, have these conversations open. So I, first of all, I want to commend you, Ambrose, and your organization for doing this. The next thing I want to say is that it's important to continue the calls for reparations, because even if these calls may not result in the exact achievements, aspirations we have, they may produce other useful results. And it continues to put pressure on the broader systems at bay, not only for past atrocities, but also to keep, to say that, we remember and we are still watching. We haven't forgot that piece, right? And that may serve as almost as a way of keeping in check even greater challenges, notwithstanding what Tavis just pointed out. It's important for us to continue to push for the decolonization of education here in the global north, but also in the global south, because in the global south, our curriculum is also heavily colonized. And it's important to continue this push. This is what will help other upcoming generations to have different views on their history and that might produce more of a collective commitment to looking at the type of world that is and what they want and how they can change it. so we need to normalize the talk of reparations, right? That it's not just about money. I hate just the money part. I think the money is important because, in some ways it takes cash to care. But I think the other structural and epistemic and cultural pieces are even more important. If you give someone money with the same mindset as they have, probably nothing will change, right? What we need is the type of reparation that can help to produce different mindsets and to look at the world in different ways and to think about futures in different ways. And thinking about futures, this is where I would end, that as the global discourse on climate change and environmental degradation and the new climate change development discourse unfolds, let's keep a close eye on that. Because if we look at it, we'll realize that there are colonized approaches weaving themselves into the new discourse around climate change. And we may be so concerned about the past atrocities that we forget that something now that is taking place, that is going to be so fundamental to our lives, how we address climate change, that knowledge is being colonized without our input, without our interest there. And so as we think about climate change, think about things like reparations, but also ensure that whatever proposals emerge, whatever ideas emerge, whatever ways of doing and living emerge, that we ensure that that justice is fundamentally a part of this way going forward, particularly for people of color who have historically borne the brunt of Western capitalist unsustainable lifestyles.
Thank you. Thank you, Nigel. And thank you also, Tavis. And then this is going to be my absolute last question, final question. It's related to the last one, but slightly different. Maybe we end on a note of hope, as in what are your hopes? And then we end on that note with maybe a statement on hope. You're mute, Tavis.
My statement of hope is that we will think about how we can better the world, how we can make the world better than the way that we've reached it, the way that we've met it, how we can make humanity better than how we meet it, and how we can contribute to these different things and discussions. I think that's sort of where I would place hope in, is about what we can do. And I know that sometimes we talk about these things and it seems so grandiose. They've talked about decolonization, racial capitalism, or reparations, and it can be like, oh, what can I do? I'm just a lowly person. And sometimes it has to start at the individual level. You can do as much as you can do, and you never know who you're touching, whose life you're touching, or what type of change you can bring. So I think I would end on saying that go forth and do the best that you can do with the resources that you have at hand today, because you don't know what tomorrow brings.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think I'm hopeful because, as an educator, I see young people every day, and I see a bunch of young people who are fundamentally, fundamentally find our state as human beings and the state of the world as deeply abhorrent. And they are committed to addressing these issues around notions of justice, whether it's issues around climate, racism, gender. And that's where my hope is. And that's what gives me hope on a daily basis, that they are actually the new generation, at least the subset that I'm exposed to. And also what I see globally, that the movement by young people are quite progressive. And as much as we can, we have to encourage them.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Nigel. Thank you, Tavis, and thank you also everyone who's joined us. This session has been part of the Leicester Human Rights Arts and Film Festival, and it's also part of Forced Migration in the Arts. And the festival will finish tomorrow with an event focusing on genocide. You are all welcome to attend. And also, I would like, Civic Leicester and the festival and other things that I'm involved with, would like to keep coming back to this conversation, to conversations like this. So if any of you who are present have got other ideas that we can explore, please let me know. If you email, we'll pick it up and develop it further. So on that note, and without more from me, I say thank you very much and have a brilliant rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.